Vâng, xin kính chào toàn thể quý vị đại biểu, các thầy cô giáo cũng như là các bạn học viên, sinh viên đã tham gia phiên buổi chiều của hội thảo dịch thuật trong thời đại 4.0, đào tạo, nghiên cứu và thực tiễn diễn ra tại trường Đại học Ngoại ngữ Đại học Quốc gia Hà Nội và online ở trên phần mềm Zoom. Thay mặt ban tổ chức, sáng nay trong phiên tọa đàm thì các vị khách quý đã được giới thiệu rồi, và để tiết kiệm thời gian thì ban tổ chức xin được phép không giới thiệu lại các quý vị đại biểu nữa, và xin gửi lời từ ban tổ chức cảm ơn đến hai nhà tài trợ của hội thảo hôm nay. Xin giới thiệu đại diện cũng như là gửi lời cảm ơn đến công ty cổ phần giáo dục và dịch thuật Vedico. Xin được cảm ơn và giới thiệu đại diện của công ty cổ phần dịch thuật và phần mềm Star Việt Nam. Sự ủng hộ cũng là đóng góp của hai đơn vị đã góp phần không nhỏ vào thành công của hội thảo ngày hôm nay. Và để trước khi chúng ta bắt đầu phiên toàn thể, thay mặt ban tổ chức tôi xin phép được hướng dẫn ngắn gọn về một số thao tác kỹ thuật cho người tham dự hội thảo ngày hôm nay. Quý vị đang ở phiên Zoom của phiên toàn thể, và lát nữa đến các phiên song song thì những tính năng kỹ thuật cũng tương tự như vậy. Xin được phép chia sẻ màn hình. Xin hỏi các quý vị và mọi người có nhìn thấy màn hình Zoom đang được chia sẻ không ạ?
Có nhìn thấy.
Chúng ta lưu ý đến các tính năng ở bên dưới màn hình. Thì đầu tiên là micro của toàn thể quý vị thì được tự động tắt do ban tổ chức tắt ạ. Và chúng ta không thể tự bật micro của mình lên. Vì thế trong phiên toàn thể, sau khi diễn giả đã trình bày cũng như là sau khi trong các phiên song song và chúng ta có câu hỏi, vâng, nếu chúng ta xin phép để chia sẻ lại màn hình ạ. Và xin phép hai diễn giả lát nữa chúng ta sẽ xem màn hình sau ạ. Nếu như quý vị có câu hỏi gì đối với người trình bày thì chúng ta sử dụng tính năng raise hand, bật mic để chủ tọa có thể biết và bật mic cho quý vị đặt câu hỏi. Thứ hai, với tính năng video, chúng ta được quyền tự bật hoặc là tắt camera của mình. Hiện nay thì rất nhiều quý vị cũng như là các bạn sinh viên ở đây đã thay đổi virtual background, tức là background ảo, để chúng ta đều thống nhất một cái sắc tím như thế này, đúng không ạ? Thế còn những ai mà chưa thay đổi mà có mong muốn thì đề nghị phía kỹ thuật có thể gửi cái file background vào trong một lần nữa vào trong chat box để mọi người có thể tải về và thay. Thì thay ở đâu? Ở trong virtual background, mọi người chọn choose virtual background, và sau đó sau khi đã tải background về thì chúng ta bấm vào nút dấu cộng này để tải lên và bấm đúng vào background chúng ta muốn sử dụng. Tuy nhiên lưu ý là với chúng ta đang sử dụng máy tính cá nhân và chúng ta đang không ngồi trước màn hình key màu xanh lá cây, vì thế mà chúng ta chọn chúng ta không tích vào cái nút là I have a green screen, còn không thì hình ảnh của chúng ta sẽ âm bản như là một số quý vị đang ở đây. Và tất nhiên để sử dụng được virtual background thì cấu hình của máy tính cũng phải đủ nữa. Trong trường hợp đẹp thì chúng ta sẽ sử dụng, còn không chúng ta cứ sử dụng background thật ở nơi mà mọi người đang ngồi. Hướng dẫn tiếp theo là trong nút participant này có nút raise hand như lúc nãy tôi có hướng dẫn, thì mọi người vào trong đó với tính năng là participant thì ở bên trái cái nút yes này hiện nay đang là các vai host và co-host thì không có, nhưng mà participant thì sẽ có nút raise hand. Chúng ta bấm vào nút đó để báo cho chủ tọa biết là chúng ta có nhu cầu phát biểu hoặc là đặt câu hỏi. Tính năng chat ở đây thì cho phép toàn bộ những người tham dự hội thảo cũng như là các viên đều được chat với tất cả các thành viên cũng như là những người cụ thể ở trong phiên này, và như vậy là tính năng chat là không khóa và điểm mở, chúng ta có thể tận dụng để trao đổi với những người tham dự các cái phiên cũng như là phiên toàn thể cũng như là phiên song song. Hội thảo này có một tính năng rất là quan trọng mà chúng ta có thể nếu cần thì chúng ta khai thác, đó là nút interpretation. Hiện nay ngôn ngữ ở phiên toàn thể chúng tôi đang sử dụng là tiếng Việt. Trong trường hợp mọi người cần nghe phần phiên dịch sang các thứ tiếng khác thì bấm vào đây và chọn cái thứ tiếng mà mình muốn nghe. Hiện tại thì đang có là tiếng Việt và tiếng Anh. Lúc này đang là không nghe kênh phiên dịch, đúng không ạ? Và khi chọn sang một kênh phiên dịch thì chúng ta có thể chọn tắt cái âm thanh gốc đi hoặc là vẫn để nghe cả hai thứ tiếng, thế là tùy quý vị ạ. Một số hướng dẫn về kỹ thuật như vậy. Còn một điều nữa là chúng ta nên đổi tên. Đổi tên thì để theo như là hướng dẫn của ban tổ chức đã gửi đến các quý vị. Trong trường hợp ai đó chưa kịp làm, chúng ta có thể click luôn vào cửa sổ của mình và chọn nút rename để chúng ta đặt tên. Những người là moderator thì đặt MOD, speaker thì đặt là speaker và sau đó là họ tên đầy đủ, đúng không ạ? Còn những người tham dự thì chúng ta cũng cố gắng đổi lại họ tên đầy đủ, họ tên của mình thay vì là một cái tên nào khác. Xin cảm ơn quý vị với phần hướng dẫn kỹ thuật như vậy. Hy vọng là các phiên buổi chiều hôm nay chúng ta sẽ không có vấn đề gì xảy ra, không để quý vị và các bạn chờ đợi lâu hơn nữa. Sau đây xin trân trọng kính mời tiến sĩ Đỗ Hoàng Ngân, Phó trưởng phòng phụ trách phòng khoa học công nghệ của trường Đại học Ngoại ngữ Đại học Quốc gia Hà Nội sẽ lên điều hành phiên toàn thể. Xin mời cô Ngân ạ.
Good afternoon, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. I'd like to welcome you all on behalf of the organizers to Plenary Session. Xin phép các quý vị, tôi xin nói bằng tiếng Việt để tiện cho các phiên dịch các thứ tiếng khác nữa, chứ không chỉ tiếng Anh ạ. Trong 3 phiên tọa đàm sáng hôm nay, chúng ta cũng đã được nghe những chia sẻ rất là tâm huyết và rất là giá trị từ các chuyên gia dày dặn kinh nghiệm trong lĩnh vực biên phiên dịch và đào tạo biên phiên dịch. Nối tiếp chương trình của hội thảo, trong cái phiên toàn thể chiều nay, tôi xin trân trọng giới thiệu đầu tiên một diễn giả thứ nhất, đó là một chuyên gia kỳ cựu trong đào tạo biên phiên dịch tại Việt Nam. Phó giáo sư tiến sĩ Lê Hùng Tiến là cán bộ nghiên cứu và giảng dạy cao cấp thuộc Trung tâm Nghiên cứu Giáo dục Ngôn ngữ và Quốc tế học, Trường Đại học Ngoại ngữ Đại học Quốc gia Hà Nội. Ông đã có nhiều năm nghiên cứu và giảng dạy về lý luận dịch và cũng đã có nhiều bài viết và chuyên luận về dịch thuật. Và hiện nay thì ông là trưởng nhóm nghiên cứu về dịch thuật của Trường Đại học Ngoại ngữ Đại học Quốc gia Hà Nội. Hướng quan tâm chính trong nghiên cứu và giảng dạy của ông là lý luận dịch thuật và phương pháp nghiên cứu trong ngôn ngữ học ứng dụng. Giáo sư tiến sĩ Lê Hùng Tiến cũng là thầy giáo của rất là nhiều thế hệ sinh viên cũng như là học viên cao học, nghiên cứu sinh. Và xin trân trọng mời Phó giáo sư. Hôm nay Phó giáo sư sẽ chia sẻ về xu hướng phát triển và những thách thức của giáo dục biên phiên dịch và những gợi ý cho đào tạo và nghiên cứu dịch thuật ở Việt Nam. Trân trọng kính mời Phó giáo sư.
Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished guests, conference participants. I'd like to say hello rather than good afternoon because I know that it's afternoon already in Vietnam, but it may be still morning in America or in Europe, and only evening in Australia or Japan. So hello again. I'm very glad to have a wonderful chance given by UCIT to talk about one of the topics of great concern of many of us, I mean many of my colleagues, students. The topic is trends, directions, challenges in translator, interpreter education, and implication for education and research in Vietnam. Here are the talking points. First, the first major one is current trends, direction, and challenges in interpreter and translator education and research. In my presentation, to save time, I will say INT for interpreter and translator. So INT education means interpreter and translator training, education, sorry. And this umbrella cover the following subpoints. The turns in translation studies, studies on translation competence, developments in curriculum and training methodology. And the second major one is challenges and implication for INT education and research in Vietnam. First, let's look at the landscapes of INT education in the world. There are two driving forces that impact the landscapes nowadays of INT education. The first one is external impacts. The second one, internal impacts. And I will talk about each type of impacts in great detail. First, let's move on external impacts. First of all, I'd like you to read a quotation of House, 2015. The impact of globalization on the world economy, international communication and politics have made translation become much more important than ever before. By saying much more important than ever before, Howe has pointed out a lot of reasons. First, information distribution via translation promotes a worldwide translation industry now. Information quickly disseminated across the world in different languages. Tourist information worldwide and information flow in globalized companies. And nowadays, a lot of tourist companies would like to disseminate the information about tourist sites in their local languages rather than English. And that is why native languages for sale potential is now replacing English as lingua franca. The next reason is growing demand for translation in localization industry, World Wide Web, and increase of non-English speaking web, e-learning in many different languages. So translation has become not an integral part of this world, not a byproduct of globalization. And I'd like to show you again a very well-known statement made by Kelly in 1979, and it still holds true now. There's no history of the world without translation. Let's move on to internal impacts. Research, theoretical development in translation studies leading to, first, new research findings in the nature of translation and translation competence from 1950s to early 2000s. We know that the translation studies started as the autonomous discipline rather late as compared to other disciplines. And in the mid of the 20th century, the research studies on translation nature, translation process, and translation competence, which are the background of INT training, started in Europe. And then comes the development in curriculum design and methodology in IT education. The other impact is the professionalization of translation and interpreting, and deepening knowledge base for INT education. And so the focus of research interest in INT education since mid 20th century are as follows. First, the nature of translation and interpreting process. Then, new understandings of translation competence. These major points set the grounds for modern INT training and education nowadays. Next is development in curriculum design and methodology in IT education, professionalization of translation and interpreting, and deepening of knowledge base for INT education. So in conclusion, research in translation nature has brought about major turns in translation studies. I'd like to talk about the major turns in translation studies and the recognition of translation nature. First is linguistic turn. Before 1950, literary translation was a branch of comparative literature. And whenever we talk about translation or translation evaluation, at that time, we would talk about comparative literature and nothing about linguistics related to our discussion literature. But during 1950s, things changed dramatically. First, research focused on translation of non-literary language made translation studies a subdivision of linguistics, and it became a turn from traditional view of translation. I'd like to show you a very well-known model of translation by Jacobson in his well-known essay on linguistic aspect of translation, written in 1959. This is a triadic system of translation, three ways of interpreting a verbal signs. First, intra and lingual translation. Interlingual translation, or we name it proper translation. And third, intersemiotic translation. The advancements of these models as compared to the traditional model, I mean, all the models developed before 1950, it views translation from semiotic viewpoint. And the verbal signs are considered lexical item or grammatical structure, formalism or structuralist linguistic descriptions. And translation process is viewed as a matter of transferring words and structures. And text was seen as a string of words and sentences. However, the development of this model is significant for translation studies because translation goes beyond language in verbal sense. Let's move on to a pragmatic turn. This is a general trends of linguistics during the 1970s. A move toward holistic notion of the text and enriched by insight from anthropology, philosophy, sociology, and psychology. The pragmatic turns in linguistics were marked with the following developments in linguistics. First, the speak-act theory, the rise of text linguistics, the functional approach to language. This leads to reorientation of the lines of thought, constructive studies losing influence on translation studies. Before this landmark, all discussion on translation process, translation nature were based on what you call formalism or structuralist view of language. And so all discussions were related to the transferring of words, lexical units, and grammatical structures, and studies based on the notion of text type and translation purpose or scopus theory in Germany, and the influence of systemic functional grammar, discourse, and pragmatic analysis as a great landmark in language and translation studies. And the pragmatic turn came into being. First, Halliday works on systemic functional grammar in 1976, and on cohesion, Heine and Hassan, 1976, were the main driving forces for the pragmatic turn in linguistic and translation studies. At the same time, in German-speaking world, the works by Robert Burgran and Wolf Dressler, Introduction to Text Linguistics in 1981, text was considered as communicative occurrence with 7 criteria of textuality, such as coherence, cohesion, intentionality, acceptability, informativity, stillativity, and intertextuality. And that led to the treatment of text from functional viewpoint in translation. The reproduction of text function textuality rather than its lexical items or grammatical structures. And thus, it's a notable differentiation between literary translation and non-literary translation. Now let's move on to cultural turn. During the 1980s, studies on literature translation, such as Herman's 1985, Torrey 1985, Snell-Hornby 1988, Bassinet and Lefebvre 1990, 1998, etc., with important assumptions and views. First, literature is considered a complex and dynamic system. They proposed a new approach to literary translation called descriptive, target-oriented, and functional and systemic. The norms and constraints governing the production and reception of translations were proposed. Then the central issue of translation process is on function of the translation in target culture, but not the linguistic features of source text. And so translation or the target language version of literature has become part of sociological context and a system within system, which is called polysystem. And so I'd like you to read a very important quotation from Torrey, 1985, as the starting point for proposal for the culture turns in translation studies. Consequently, translators operate first and foremost in the interest of the culture into which they are translating, and not in the interest of the source text, let alone the source culture. So by culture here, Torrey means the entire social context involved in the translation, along with the norms, conventions, ideology, and value of that society or receptor system. So the place and role of translations, both within a given literature and in interaction between literatures. So neither the word nor the text, but the culture is operational unit of translation. And culture turn is the study of translation in terms of cultural, political, and ideological context. And that led to a new paradigms in translation study, descriptive translation studies. Now I'd like to move on to the present day stage when translation studies as an integrating and interdisciplinary approach. The landscape of translation studies and IT education research have changed greatly since the 1990s because during the 1990s, there were incorporations of new schools and concepts in translation studies. First is the problem of ideology, research into gender, the post-colonial studies or cultural studies oriented analysis of translation. Then corpus studies and the cognitive approaches over the last few decades. So the integrating and interdisciplinary approaches have made translation studies interdisciplinary in nature. So from integrating and interdisciplinary perspectives, translation studies establish relations with first linguistics, especially with semantics, pragmatic, applied linguistics, contrastive linguistics, corpus linguistics, and cognitive linguistics. Second, modern languages, at least the two languages in concern. Third, comparative literature. Fourth, cultural studies. And last, philosophy, especially language and meaning. On the applied side of translation studies, translation has established links with law, politics, medicine, finance, and so forth. This is called ESP translation of ESP text. According to Hurtado, 2001, with integrating an interdisciplinary approach, translation is viewed as first, an act of communication, second, a text operation, and third, a cognitive activity. And these provide us with the fullest view of translation, a renewed impetus in the study of translation nature. Now I'd like to move on to the second major findings that has impact greatly on INT education. The quality approaches open up interesting new paths for research in the current translation studies landscape. It has brought about great significance for INT education, the mental process involved in the course of translation task, and the capacity that INT are required to possess in order to do it adequately, called translation competence. So the studies in cognitive approaches to translation, cognitive translation studies has become a great contribution to the developments of INT education. Okay, so I'd better skip this one because I don't think much time left for me. Now let's move on to the findings from translation competence studies. First, the findings from Nube 2000 study. There are 5 components of translation competence: language competence, textual competence, subject competence, cultural competence, and transfer competence. Among these 5 competence, the transfer competence is the core translation competence because it distinguishes a translator from a bilingual person. Bilingual competence is merely a starting point and is only necessary for translation only. Bilingual person cannot automatically become a translator for many reasons. So transfer competence have translation competence, and different components of competence constantly interact with each other to enable a person to work as a professional translator and interpreter. According to Writing 2002, translation is a complex problem-solving activity that becomes possible due to the following components: declarative knowledge, linguistic knowledge, cultural knowledge, procedural knowledge, translation strategies, translation norms, and cognitive knowledge. This model has a very important implication for INT education. Experiencing exposure to an ever-growing range of translation situations is of crucial importance for developing translation competence. A situation-driven approach to translation competence thus means that the scope of context which a translator is competent to handle is maximally increased. Now let's move on to the next important finding from PACTE or PACTE, process of acquisition of translation competence and evaluation from University of Autonoma de Barcelona. According to PACTE, translation competence consists of the following sub-competencies: bilingual sub-competence, extra-linguistic competence, knowledge about translation competence, instrumental sub-competence, strategic sub-competence, and psychological, physiological components. According to House 2018, the common requirements for INT are as follows. First, mastery of proficiency of source language and target language, thorough knowledge of source and target cultures, familiarity with the topic and register, vocabulary wealth, and awareness of free phrase process. And apart from these 5 common requirements for both INT, House also points out 5 more requirements for interpreter. An interpreter must possess short-term memory for storage and retrieval, acquaintance with prosodic features and different accents, quick wittedness and full attention, and knowledge of shorthand writing for consecutive interpreting, and sound composure. But I'm afraid nowadays note-taking skill is much better than shorthand writing. I don't know why, how put it in her textbook. So from competence models mentioned above, a comprehensive model of INT competence can consist of 3 major components. First, general competence. Second, translation production competence. And very important, workplace-oriented translation competence. This is from Hussein Ali, 2012. Workplace-oriented definition of translation competence. According to Kiroli, 2002, there are 2 basic types of translation competence: translation competence and translator competence. Basing on these 2 types of competence, Bernardini, 2004, suggests 2 important concepts: translator training and translator education. These concepts lead to different curricular and training programs at different levels. Now I'd like to move on to I think a very important finding from House about the translation competence and the modern training and education of interpreter and translator. House point out that translation competence is context and situation dependent. The idea is shared by other scholars like Nuber, Curry, Bernardini, Tasnoli, and Liu. In their studies on translation competence and I&T education, according to House, a translator competence must be judged with reference to the demands from the context of translation situation. So the development of I&T competence is widening context of situation for producing a translation that fulfills communicative function. That leads to a situation-driven approach to translation education. The scope of context which a translator is competent to handle is maximally increased. Now, I'd like to move on to the pedagogical aspects of translation studies. Basing on the findings mentioned above, experts on curriculum development and curriculum design have proposed different models of I&T education and training. Now let's look at the models of training programs worldwide since the 1950s. I mean the second half of the 20th century up to now. There are four models: continental model, the British approach, the market-oriented approach, and Scandinavian approach, according to Scheuer 2004. The continental approach was carried out as academic courses in universities only. The training has been organized in the form of complete undergraduate program, leading to a degree in interpreting or translation and interpreting. The common models: first, 2-year introductory courses, specialization phases with 2 years of interpreter training. The continental approach has the following characteristic. First, students receive a relatively thorough training in both translation and interpreting. Then the basic degree. After basic degree, students can continue to postgraduate courses. Language instruction in the working languages is part of the curriculum, and formal entrance tests are usually not allowed. Now let's move on to market-oriented approach. This is strictly labor market-oriented education, and it's given by academic and non-academic institutions around the world. The emphasis lies on the training of interpreting skill only. The skills have been predefined by professional organization, the International Organization of Conference and Interpreters. And the characteristic of market-oriented approach are as follows. Teaching and examination are carried out by professional interpreters. Schools are assessed according to quality criteria set by the professional organizations. Now let's look at the pedagogy and methodology of I&T training. The diagram shows the syllabus design for translator suggested by Cho, 1988. We've got 3 types of syllabus design: grammar-based syllabus, culture-based syllabus, and text-based syllabus. In terms of curriculum, there are a lot of critical comments on the nowadays curriculums in INT education institutions. First one is by Snell Hornby. Hornby points out that there were a great need for curriculum reform in INT education because many curriculum were designed according to fixed continental design rather than market-oriented curriculum design. And the need for training is a professional context. So the implementation of alternative forms of testing that reflect the reality of future professional life is needed. And following are curriculum models. There are 5 basic curriculum models in translator and interpreter education. First, linear model. Then modified linear model. The Y or forked track model. The modified Y track model. The parallel track model. This is a linear model. So after basic translation competence training, students move on to advanced translation competence training. This is modified linear model. After basic translation competence training, the student may choose whether to choose advanced translation competence or basic advanced interpretation competence training. Next is the parallel track model. Translation and interpretation are trained as 2 independent specialities like this. Y fork model. Students start with core translation and interpretation competence training, and then they may select either advanced translation competence or advanced interpretation competence training. The modified Y forked. All students enrolled in core translation and interpretation competence training courses, and then they will divide it into 3 groups, specialist groups for advanced translation competence, language studies, business policy study, and advanced interpretation competence. And this diagram shows the difference between translator training and translator education. By translator training, the courses aims at training translation competence only. And by translator education, students are trained to become translator who are able to work in certain locality or context. Now let's move on to the approaches. There are 2 main approaches for translator training and education. Task-based translator training and using parallel text in translator training environment. This is a framework for task-based translator training. There are 4 stages. First, quality assessment, then translation process, and web work, and finally, final assessment. According to Pearson, 2003, consulting online parallel corpora can help student translator learn how information is conveyed in translation and what strategies professional translators employ to solve different translation problems. So the parallel corpora can be useful in providing student translator with insights into different strategies for dealing with culture-specific information. So using parallel text in translator and interpreter training is also a new approach, especially it is related to the selection of teaching material or the main focus of teaching material development in interpreter and translator training. This diagram shows the use of comparable corpora and parallel corpora in translator training environment. Comparable corpora contain only original text in the source and target languages, while parallel corpora contain source text and their translations. So contain evidence of language produced in bilingual environment. And Pearson has pointed out very important role of parallel and corpora. It's our belief that parallel corpora have a role to play in translator training environment. That students can use corpora parallel to help them with translation, and that the findings from corpus-based studies of parallel corpora can and should inform the designs and implementation of specialized translation courses. I'd like to move on to the challenges to translation training nowadays. According to Vanity 2017, in his very well-known books, Teaching Translation, there are three institutional etymonies. First, too many translation programs and courses are staffed by faculty members who neither translate nor conduct research in translation. It happens in the United States, in Europe, and in many other training institutions in the world. The decision by faculty members to dedicate themselves to any form of translation practice or research continues to be tantamount to jeopardizing one's academic career. And the model of translation that is taught is too often instrumental rather than interpretive. So according to Peter Newmark, the success of any translation course must depend 65% on the personality of the teacher, 20% on the course design, and 10% on course materials. So you can see how important is the role of a trainer or teachers in INT education. And this also constitutes a big challenge to INT training in the world now. What about Vietnam? There are a lot of challenges to INT education in our country now. First, INT education is still under-researched, so it fails to provide appropriate theoretical ground for practice. Research in translation between Vietnamese and other language is still based on theories developed a few decades ago, mainly on formalism of the first turn in translation studies. And many researchers still say that we got stuck in formalism in Vietnamese linguistics now. So these lead to challenges in adequate recognition of the many defining issues in research and IT education in Vietnam. Lack of appropriate background information for practice leads to blind practice or trial and error methodology in education and training. Many translation courses in Vietnam are fully integrated into the university system and linked to academic departments. So the challenge is that we are now got stuck in the past fixed training curricula and models. The wide variety of forms is that Programs can take in the undergraduate courses from the third year to the fourth year, mainly following the fixed continental linear model with grammar and text-based syllabus. Currently, there is no institution offering MA course in translation in Vietnam. The earliest university degree course in translation, the BA in translation, started about 3 decades ago, together with the professional training in various colleges and universities of foreign languages. And the number of programs offering INT has grown considerably nationwide. By September 2016, the number of INT trained courses has amounted to 40 throughout the country. So most trainers, practitioners are self-trained or moved from language teaching or language teacher training sections of the training institutions. So faculty members who neither translate nor conduct research in translation, as pointed out by Venuti. The training and education of INT constitute a serious pedagogical challenges. So at present, there's no independent organization for INT accreditation in Vietnam, and translation certificates are granted by training institutions only. So much still to be done for INT education in higher education to be in line with real-world criteria and the market demands. So from my own perspectives, INT education in Vietnam needs an up-to-date theoretical ground that adequately informs practice, a wide audience of translation scholars, INT trainers and translator trainees, reliable empirical studies undertaken by translation scholars, trainers in Vietnam to address a number of defining questions in the field of INT education. They are as follows: national, cultural, social, political, and economic development, and the role of translation and INT within such developments. Present demands for INT in Vietnam, especially the job market, job hunting context, and kinds of job for graduates. Translation competence appropriate for INT working in Vietnam, but not elsewhere in the world. Accreditation standards, competencies, tests of translation proficiency.
Xin lỗi và thì gói gọn là giúp ạ.
Just 1 minute. Refinement of professional experiences and informed application of professional knowledge and practices within Vietnamese context. The overall translation program for INT training or enrollment, such as enrollment requirements, language proficiency, credits, assessment, etc. Translation modules and courses well incorporated in the curriculum design in general and particularly for training institution and the locality. Particular translation teaching methods and techniques, the teaching procedure, teaching material development, and also the language support programs, including Vietnamese. The theoretical and analytical basis of student competence assessment. Staff instructor training programs, particular to those who teach translation practice, and the chance for them to interact with their counterparts in and out Vietnam, seminars or other ways, such as this conference. Abandon the pursuit of one general curriculum which fits all models and needs all contexts. The training models using many resources, including personal biography, interaction skills, knowledge, attitude, and social capital. And last but not least, education policy makers, decision makers, and administrators also should embrace the changes mentioned above. These are the materials that I based on in preparing my presentation, and I don't think we got the time for Q&A, but I'm very glad to receive your question or comments through the chat box. So thank you very much for listening. Over to you, Chair. Women.
Yeah, thank you very much for your most interesting presentation. Yeah, the presentation gave a landscape of translator and interpreter education in the world with implication for education and research in Vietnam. I think we may have some minutes of Q&A after the second presentation. Yeah, so because we don't have much time. So now I'm very delighted to introduce our second presentation. Yeah. Dr. Dinh Dien, Dr. Dinh Dien from University of Sciences, Vietnam National University, Ho Chi Minh City.
Okay. Can you see my slide? Can you see my slide? Hello? Can you see my slide?
Yeah. So not yet. Okay, just a minute, Dr. Dien. I'm closing my share screen.
Excuse me, thấy được slide của tôi chưa? Hello, can you see my slide?
Okay.
Yeah.
It's okay now.
Okay, yeah, okay. Now. Okay, shall we start now? May I start now?
Yeah.
Okay,
Please.
now, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Today, on behalf of our group, I would like to present my research that the application of computational linguistics in translation. I'm working in Computational Linguistics Center of Vietnam National University of Ho Chi Minh City. Now, my presentation here, we have four content. The first content, we talk about introduction to computational linguistics. And the second, we talk about how about the machine translation and human translation. What is the strong point and what is the weak point? And the third point, we talk about computer-assisted translation. I think this is a trade-off solution. And the final, we talk about the future trend in translation in Vietnam. Now, first, I would like to talk about the introduction to computational linguistics. What is computational linguistics? Computational linguistics is an interdisciplinary field. This is a combination of linguistics and computer science. In that, the study about the computational modeling of natural languages to solve a linguistic question. For example, text classification, text analysis, text summarization, and text translation. That is the content we talk today. And recently, computational linguistics use artificial intelligence, machine learning, especially deep learning. And from that, we have a great progress. And CL, computational linguistics, there are many applications from in economy, society, science, and technology and education. So today we talk about the application of computational linguistics in translation. So I have just said that CL, computational linguistics, use machine learning. So what is machine learning? Machine learning is a branch of artificial intelligence focused on building application that learn from training data and improve their accuracy over time without being programmed to do so. And today we talk about machine translation. So machine translation is automatic translation. It is processed by which computer software to use to translate a text from natural language to another one. For example, Google Translate, Bing Translator, Systran software. Um, I have explained that in machine translation, they use machine learning. In machine learning, the most important that is training data. So what is training data in machine translation? That is parallel text. Professor Lê Hồng Tín have just say about parallel text in teaching language. So parallel text, or another name, bilingual corpus, is also used for machine translation. That is the text translated by human translator, human translation. For example, this is parallel text. Left hand side is the source, right hand side is the target, translate from English to Vietnamese. And computer will learn translation technique, translation experience from this training data. Then computer will apply those technique and experience to translate new text. For example, so far you have a motion translation, can you text translation, you type text translate into from English to Chinese, or even you can type a voice translation. For example, you say machine translation or human translation, it automatic. You can hear 翻机机器翻译还是人工翻译. Even you can show a picture. For example, you saw the picture Zenkinomi, they also translate into English cash only. Now, what's motion translation? What is I have explained to you? Motion translation recently and improve the quality and faster and cheaper. This is a strong point. And besides, they have can serve a big volume and security. Another strong point of motion translation that we can use at any time, anywhere, because so far there are many free tools. For example, Google Translate, Bing Translator, you can use any time, anywhere. And it can translate many different languages. And besides, they can retrain easily, quickly. If you train in other domain, they can translate very suitable in that domain. The quality now, day by day, they constant improving. That is the strong point of machine translation. But what is the weak point? What is the weak point of machine translation? The first one, that is accuracy. Accuracy of machine translation is inconsistent. Case by case, some case the accuracy is high, some case is low. And it cannot, machine translation cannot translate figurative language, cultural context. And finally, the quality of machine translation mostly depend on training corpus. That is the main content I would like to talk about. Because we must understand when is the accuracy high, when is accuracy low, in order that we can have the method for improve it, or we can edit. Now I emphasize on depend on training corpus. You understand that machine translation is not equally successful for all language pair. In some language pair, translate very good, but some language pair translate very poor. Why? Because machine translation quality depend on following condition. The first one, that's the quantity of training corpus. If we have a very large volume, very large training corpus, the quality very high. The second, depend on quality of training corpus. Quality here may be required really parallel text. If you put input non-parallel, the quality will be low. The third one, it depends on domain. If you train depend on the domain, maybe here, maybe depend on the style, into the field, for some. And the next one depend on the readability, text readability. Some text you say that very easy, some text very difficult. This we say text readability. Text readability depend on lexicon, depend on syntax, depend on text coherence. And the next one depend on language typology. This is muchly depend on language typology because they have a many different typology in the world. For some, fractional, isolating, agglutinative, polysynthetic. And the final depend on the work order typology, maybe subject, verb, object, or subject, object, verb. Now, with more detail about each factor. The first factor depend on quantity of training corpus because machine translation uses machine learning. In machine learning, recently they use deep learning. Deep learning, they require a big data. So if you have as much as possible training corpus, the quality will be high. The larger the training corpus, the higher the translation quality. That's the reason some language pair is very high quality. For example, English Chinese or English French. Why? Because they are popular languages. But with popular languages, you can easily to collect a large training corpus. But some minor language, for example, you translate from Japanese to Vietnamese, it is difficult to collect much corpus or Lao to Vietnamese. We say this is low language resources. In that case, we must use another language, we say private language. For example, you want to translate Lao to Vietnamese. This will translate Lao to English, then English to Vietnamese. If you translate in that way, the currency will be lower. The second reason is we talk about quality. Quality, for example, you see in an event, this event in English, Prime Minister Nguyễn Xuân Phúc arrived in Washington on May 31st, 2017. This is already a short sentence. How to translate into English, into Vietnamese? If you translate into Vietnamese, Thủ tướng Nguyễn Xuân Phúc đã đến Washington vào ngày 31 tháng 5 năm 2017. If you translate in this, we say that parallel sentence. This is good training corpus. But if you translate in another way, correct me, for example, you translate into Vietnamese. Yesterday, the leader of Vietnamese government arrived the capital of United States. We suppose that that news June 1st in 2017. In that way, the meaning is correct, but it's not sentence, not parallel. We say this in non-parallel. We say that comparable sentence. If you in training the machine translation by comparable, by non-parallel, the quality will be low. We say this is a bad training corpus. And the next one, the third one, the last, it depends on the domain of training corpus. For we have a many domain. For some maybe physics domain, biology domain, economic domain, etc. So if you training in this domain, the text you translate should coincide with the domain that to be translated. You training in which domain, you should translate the text in that domain. If you use translate in different domain, the quality will be low. However, it is difficult to correct the training corpus in some special domain. For example, in medical or in the music, or very difficult to collect the very big data. So recently, there are many research in domain application in machine translation, but the final results still limited. Now, the next one depends on we say that the difficulty of the text, or in terminology, we say text readability. For example, please read this text. Very easy. You can say, Sulawesi is an island in Indonesia. The sentence very short. The structure very simple. We say this is easy text. We say the text readability very low. The same content, but if you translate in the intermediate level, you can say this. You can see the sentence longer, and the word is more difficult, but the same meaning. But next one is a higher. The sentence is very long, and the word very difficult. So we say this is the text readability. So the quality of machine translation also depend on the text readability. So the text readability depend on, the first one depend on the lexicon, the word use. The most popular use, of course, easy word. And the second one depend on the syntactic structure complexity. You understand, for the simple structure, of course, easier than complex structure. And the next one depend, and the third factor that depends on text organization, about the coherent. Okay. So You please distinguish between readability and comprehensibility. I'm talking readability, not comprehensibility. That's the reason in the common European frame reference, they classify into many levels, A1, A2, B1, B2, depend on readability. Or even in Microsoft book, they also the tool for measure the text readability. So they have a many frame display. This is the frame for the text readability from very easy or very difficult or something. So in general, the higher the text readability, the lower the motion translation accuracy. So if you know the text readability, you can apply for lower text readability, you can use a motion translation, but higher we must use a human translation. Now, more detail. The first, I said that the text readability depends on 3 factors. The first factor depends on work frequency. So what is the work frequency here? For example, English, the most popular word in English, for example, the, of, be, and for example. Similar for Chinese, for example, the most popular, the, sư, bủ, wo, yi, you, ta, etc. In Vietnamese, the most popular, và, của, có. Now, we use the computer to measure the work frequency. And from work frequency, we can know about the in Vietnamese for some via. In Vietnamese, there are many different meanings. The first meaning is the conjunction, but the second meaning is put the food in the mouth. So that based on the work frequency, we can measure the text readability. And the second factor depends on the syntactic structure. For example, this is the syntax tree of the simple sentence, but it is a complex sentence. Complex sentence, of course, the text readability is higher than the simple sentence. And the next factor affect to motion translation quality. Very important. That is the language typology. In language typology, they classify in 4 language typology. The first one, we say fractional. For example, English, French, Russian. Any language, they have a variation, they have inflection during, depend on the tense, depend on the number, depend on the gender or something. For example, French is a one kind of fractional. You can see in French, if I say go in French, allez. But if I say I go in French, je vais, you go, tu vas, he goes, il va, we go, nous allons, you go, vous allez, or they go, is wrong. Meaning the word train depend on the number, depend on personal. That is the reason we say fractional. But another typology, we say the isolated, opposite to fractional. In isolated, the word doesn't change during in the gender, in the tense. For example, Chinese, Vietnamese, Thai, Lao. Now, how to say in Vietnamese? If I say I see him, in Vietnamese, tôi thấy anh ấy. In Chinese, the same. 我看他. But if we change, he sees me. In Vietnamese, anh ấy thấy tôi. You can see anh ấy or tôi doesn't change. But in English, we change from him to he, from he subject to him object, I subject to me object. But in Chinese, 我看他，他看我 doesn't change. So that is the reason we say isolated. Because isolated or inflection affect strongly to motion translation. So the next one is agglutinative. For example, Japanese, Korean, Turkish. For in agglutinative, the inflection is higher than. For example, if you say, I read a book. I read a book. In Japanese, watashi wa hon o yomimasu. But if I say, I read a book. In the past, I read a book. In Japanese, watashi wa hon o yomimasu. If I want to talk about negative, I don't read a book. In Japanese, watashi wa hon o yomimasen. If I say in past negative, I did not read a book. In Japanese, watashi wa hon o yomimasen desu. So meaning the word train depend on the tense, depend on the number, depend. So that is the reason in translation, immersion translation, very difficult to solve about variation, about inflection. And another polysyllabic we don't talk. So depend on the typology we have. If the source language and the target language are the same language typology. I'm talking in this case of same training corpus size. So the quality will be high. So that is the reason if you translate English to French, the quality very high. Why? Because the same typology, inflection typology. Or Japanese to Korean, the quality also high because of the same language ability typology. Or Chinese to Vietnamese also high because the same typology isolating. But if that's the reason when you translate from English to French, the quality will be higher than English to Japanese. Why? Because English Japanese different typology. English Chinese different typology. Chinese Japanese different typology. Korean Vietnamese also different typology. If the same typology, the quality will be higher the different typology. So if you know about the weak point of machine translation, in the future we can know when we can edit, when we edit the translate machine translation. And the next will depend on the inflection of language. You know, French, English also inflection language. French also inflection language. Russian also inflection language, and Latin the same. But about we talk about the highly inflected. French is highly inflected than English. Russian higher than French. That's the reason in this morning for a specialist Hill in Google say that when you translate from English to Russian, very difficult. Why? Because Russian is a very highly inflected language. Okay, because they have many different work forms, so computer very difficult to catch up on different work forms. If you translate highly inflected language, requires a larger training corpus. And the last one, motion translation depend on the word order. For example, we say, I read a book. This is the subject verb object. This follows the same. This is the same order for English, Chinese, French, Vietnamese, and most we use a subject verb object. But if you use Japanese or Korean, the order is different. They were subject object verb. For example, I read a book in but in Japanese, so hongo yumimasu meaning object verb different, and other works work order. And if you use the same go order, the machine translation quality will be higher. For example, that's the reason you translate from English to Japanese, English to Chinese, the quality will be higher than English to Japanese because different work order. English, Japanese, Chinese, subject verb object, but English, Japanese, subject object verb, and similar. Vietnamese to Chinese, the same subject verb object, but Vietnamese to Korean, different subject of object. So, and final, we talk about the weak point of machine translation. Because machine translation have no extra linguistic, they use intra-linguistic, they have no extra linguistic. They have no real world expression. That's the reason machine translation cannot translate idiom, proverb, metaphor, or specialized terms, slang, dialect, or some figurative language, creativity, or cultural context cannot translate. So that's the reason machine translation cannot suitable in some critical area. For example, we should not use the machine translation in translate for aviation or medical direction or law. So I have explained to you about the strong point and the weak point of machine translation. And we are human. Of course, we understand about the strong point and the weak point of human. So the problem here, how we can combine the strong point of machine translation and human translation. That is the main purpose of today. That is now today with computational linguistics. In computational linguistics, they use artificial intelligence and machine learning used and combined together and build software. That software we name CIT, stand for computer aided translation or computer assisted translation. In CAT, they use, you can see in the center they have a translation memory. This is the database. What is translation memory? This is parallel text. Now first, when you input a text, they will look up in the machine translation memory. If already they reuse it, if they are not similar, not the same, the human will post edit, will edit it. After editing, they will update to machine translation. update to translation memory. But when you input something, they have a two way. The first lookup in the translation memory. The second one called machine translator. Machine translator here, maybe Google Translate, maybe Bing Translator or other machine translation, meaning that they have combined the strength of machine translation and human translation here. They have a two choice, and we are human. We can choose which is better, which is the best, and choose the best one. And besides, when you update to translation memory, the translation will be synchronized to the PC cloud, cloud computing, meaning that if we use it, meaning we can reuse available text, parallel text, and we also use for in the future for inter. So if you repeat this loop many times, the parallel text, the translation memory bigger and bigger, larger and larger. So if we use CAT, we have a many benefit. The first benefit that we have a translation memory, meaning we reuse existing human translation. The second one, they help you about a terminology dictionary, the professional dictionary, because when you translate some case, we translate special domain is not difficult in syntax, but difficult in terminology. Next tool, they have used the spelling tracker, grammar tracker, and concordance to search work in the context and help you to manage the terminology. Because if you translate your project with single, you have a one translator, but we have a many translator. How you can assure you can consist about how consistent between different translator. That's what we say terminology manager. And besides, they also use translation consistency tracker. And besides, they have a support to many technical issues. For example, when you translate Word document, it's easy. But if you translate PDF or PowerPoint, very difficult to draw the picture. Here in CAT, help you to solve that problem automatically. And they use translate many different languages in the same project. And we also have a project manager about the quality assurance, about the schedule, about the cost. And also they help you to build a teamwork. Meaning if you have a big project, not only one translator, but many different translators in different area. For example, one translator in Hanoi, one translator in Cantor, in United States can cooperate with via online server, online ticket. And besides the translation memory, if you put in the cloud, they have a community, they have a global memory in that the community can share your translation. Now, so far there are many different software, for example, SDL, Trados, or WordFast, or many different. Okay, but the most popular is SDL. SDL Trados. This is a picture of SDL Trados. Beside our center, also I have another CAT. CAT is the general name. In a particular, they have SDL Trados, WordFast. This is our system. Now, I would like to talk. If we use CAT, we have another benefit. What is that? Is translation memory, because in translation is a very valuable parallel text. Meaning, from valuable parallel text, we can exploit to do many other things. For example, first we use machine translation. You use to train machine translation, because I have explained to you that machine translation use parallel corpus for training because they use machine training. So if you have a TM, we can use that TM for training to machine translation. And when you use a big data, machine translation quality will be higher. If machine translation quality higher, they are mutually support CAT, meaning that they can reduce your human force. And also, besides TM, they also support other language teaching tool. And besides, from TM, from parallel text, similar to Professor Tin said that, from parallel, we can use for study contrastive linguistics. We can compare the similarity and the difference between Vietnamese and foreign language in morphology, in syntax, in the semantic, pragmatic, etc. And also support for lexicography and even for support back to computational linguistics. For example, there are many applications of plagiarism, opinion mining in cross-lingual. And for teaching foreign language to Vietnamese or teaching Vietnamese to language foreigner. this example from TL, we can use for contrasting linguistic. This example for you can contrasting, we can compare about how to translate Saira in English, maybe happen, maybe occur or something. Or you can compare about the work order, you compare not order, this is the we compare. And besides, they also not only for English to Vietnamese, we can use a TM for all the language pair. For example, you can compare by Chinese to Vietnamese, for example, or Japanese to Vietnamese, or Korean to Vietnamese, or other. Now, even you can compare about the semantic. Now, conclusion. Machine translation cannot replace human translation. That I confirm. But it can serve as a tool to increase productivity in the translation process. So the best solution here, how we can combine machine translation and human translation. That is, we use CAT. CAT is the optimum solution to combine the strong point of machine translation and human translation. So today I explained to you about the quality of machine translation. If you understand when the quality high, when the quality low. So in the future, when you use machine translation, you use CAT. In CAT, if low quality, we can use human post editing. But high quality, we can skip it. So that is the best solution here is CAT. And from CAT, I think the design for machine translation, they also other valuable application for language. So that is the reason they said that TM, bilingual, bi meaning two, is more than two, not two. Why? Because of bilingual, they can extract the information, linguistic information, not only from short and text, but we also extract other information about the similarity, about the difference between two languages. And if in Vietnam, if we build a CAT community, so we can build a global translation memory. So I think if the global memory, we have bring the many useful application in the future. So I think CAT is the future trend of translation 4.0. That's in my presentation. Thank you for your listening.
Yeah, thank you very much. Thank you very much for your most interesting talks that are concerning with a lot of important current issues. I'm sure that after those two stimulating presentations, you would like to ask some questions or comments on some of the points of, that the speakers made. So please, if you have any questions or comments, please raise your hand. So while you are thinking about questions, I would like to just clarify one point. In the morning, I would like to make a question to Dr. Linh Điền. In the morning, you also emphasized and some other speakers also emphasize the importance of cultural knowledge in translator and in translation. So some of the problems cannot be machines cannot solve some problems. For example, they cannot translate idioms, proverbs, some special expressions, etc. So do you have any now? What problem? What issues you are doing to make important issues impossible issue possible?
Okay, now thank you for your question. Now, first I said that machine translation, they have some very good point and very weak point. But the essential weak point of machine translation, that is cannot translate the figurative language, cultural context, because cannot translate anything related cultural, related to traditional. So that the reason this is the essential limitation of machine translation. So we cannot solve right now, but I don't know, maybe in the future, in the future, more and more intelligent, but right now cannot translate. But that is the reason. If you know the weak point of machine translation, cannot translate the figurative, cannot translate the literature, cannot poetry. So in that, we should not use machine translation in translate that. But we use human translation. But when you use human translation, we put in a training corpus. In the future, when the training corpus bigger and bigger, when you last enough, I think that at that time, machine translation use artificial intelligence can learn from that corpus. But now the corpus of a literature or the corpus is very small. So right now cannot translate. So maybe in the future. Okay.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
Is there any question or comment? I hope to receive many questions or comment about my presentation. I'm sorry, I see that in the chat.
Women also.
Maybe I'm okay. I'm sorry, because in the chat they asked about the supply, about the slide. Yes, I'm ready. I will share the slide. Okay. Yes, I agree with Wang Huang. Wang Huang said that machine translation can solve problem of science side rather than material side of translation, rather than math side. That can solve about the science. So in the science, especially in the, yes, I agree with you. The meaning science technique is better than the art about the literature, the art or computing. I agree with you. I agree with Wang Huang. So because if you know now, today I would like to talk about, when is the good, when is the high accuracy, when is low accuracy, in order that in the future, when we training a translator, train interpreter, we can take advantage of strong point of machine translation when they serve in IIS analyze. So we use my analyze as a filter, filter meaning some case is a good accuracy, high accuracy, we use it, but some case is low accuracy, we must edit it. But after editing, we update into the machine to training corpus. So the training corpus is bigger and bigger. So in the future, machine can learn from training corpus. So I think that's the reason I suggest how we University of Language International, how we can organize a community, CAT community. For example, because UCIT is the biggest university in Vietnam for foreign language. How we can build CAT community, because many professors, many teachers from UCIT can translate day by day, but they don't use a common common database because they use personally. I think this is waste the valuable corpus. How we can combine together to share for global. I think this is the trend in the tendency in the future. Okay. Is there any question? Yes, I agree with Nguyen. Nguyen said that parallel corpus very yes. Parallel corpus is very useful, very valuable, very useful, not only for machine translation but other teaching. For example, you teach about especially in contrastive linguistics. In contrastive, when you compare the similarity or difference between two languages, what is the material? Parallel corpus is the best one. I agree with Nguyen. Okay, is there any question or comment? I cannot hear. Ngân, I cannot hear. Here, Ngân, please.
Yeah. Sorry. Yeah, we have met Dr. Dinh Dien this morning, but I would like to add some information about him. At present, he's a senior lecturer of Information Technology faculty and director of Computational Linguistics Center at University of Sciences, VNU, Ho Chi Minh City. And he published many books in the field of machine translation, computational lexicography, etc. For example, natural language processing, corpus linguistics, computational lexicography. Yeah, so you can read these books or his papers.
So I'm willing said to all of you my presentation, my slide, my full paper. I really say so. In my paper, I have the email. So if you're interested in my research, you can send me email. I can say you even in database. But because remember in last year I went to UCIT. I share you a parallel corpus. I share you the software. You use that software for compare the similarity and the difference between two languages: English, Vietnamese, English, Chinese, Vietnamese. So I already said to you this. So if you're interested, you send me email. I can share my material, my document. Okay. My email. Okay. Email. Okay. Email. I think I'm sorry. Email.
Thank you very much. So today in this plenary section, we have heard two very interesting presentations. The first one concerning with the few theoretical matters in translators and interpreters education. And the second one with a lot of issues concerning with apply research of computational linguistics in text translation support. Yeah, thank you very much for your excellent talks. And if you have any questions, you can contact or times in the chat box or contact with our speakers after the conference.
Because the one student asked me, can machine replace human? I say no. At first, in the near future, but in the future, I don't know. Cannot replace human right now. Okay, because one student asked me, can replace, but I answer no right now. Okay. Now I think I thank you all of you for presentation. Okay, thank you all of you. Okay, thank you, Dr.
Yeah, thank you very much.
Okay, thank you. Maybe we leave this and prepare for the product session.
Xin cảm ơn hai diễn giả của phiên toàn thể. Cảm ơn chủ tọa cô Đỗ Hoàng Ngân. Thật tuyệt vời bởi vì giờ này chúng ta có 426 người đang tham dự phiên toàn thể, và để chúng ta kịp chuyển sang các phiên song song, ban tổ chức kính đề nghị tất cả các thầy cô, các bạn chúng ta bật camera lên, chúng ta chụp. Ban tổ chức muốn ghi lại cái giây phút này ạ. Muốn chụp lại màn hình, tất cả chúng ta bật camera lên, cười thật tươi và giữ trong khoảng 3 phút được không ạ? Vâng, đồng thời thì đề nghị phía bên kỹ thuật sẽ gửi vào chat box các cái slides, trong đấy có Zoom ID cũng như là titles của các báo cáo ở các phiên song song để mọi người biết là mình sẽ join vào phiên nào. Và đúng 17 giờ 30 phút, xin mời tất cả mọi người chúng ta lại quay trở lại Zoom này để chúng ta dự phiên tổng kết ạ. Bao giờ bên kỹ thuật chụp ảnh xong thì báo giúp để mọi người sẽ kết thúc phiên toàn thể này ạ. Chúng ta cứ cười vào nhìn vào camera và cười thật tươi ạ.
Bỏ ra thì lại không nghe. Lúc này thầy Hùng, alo, lúc này thầy Tiến nói hay quá, thầy Tiến nói về cái parallel text hay quá. Thầy không còn thời gian để hỏi thầy nữa. Thầy Tiến bật mic lên thầy Tiến ơi, thầy Tiến bật mic lên thầy Tiến. Thầy Tiến bật mic lên thầy Tiến ơi. Thầy Tiến bật mic lên.
Dạ vâng ạ.
Thầy Tiến.
Dạ, lúc này thầy có nhưng mà em không còn thời gian để hỏi thầy, tại vì thầy có nói về cái parallel text em thấy thích quá. Dạ, nhưng mà em không có kịp.
Hiện nay nó đang là cái nó gọi cái nguồn để mà
Dạ đúng. Dạ, nên vì vậy
hữu hiệu.
Dạ, em nghĩ nên vì
cái đó
hai bên nó giống như là nó gọi là nó tương hộ, nó tương hộ, nó coi như là hỗ tương với nhau, thầy, nó giúp nhau lẫn nhau. Tức là có parallel text thì giúp cho dịch máy tốt hơn, mà dịch máy tốt hơn thì quay lại giúp cho người thôi đó. Hai bên nó tác động qua lại đó thầy. Nên
dạ vâng. Vâng ạ, em xin cảm ơn hai thầy và rất xin lỗi hai thầy bởi vì đến giờ chúng ta phải vào.
Chụp chưa.
Dạ, bên kỹ thuật đã chụp xong ạ. Cảm ơn mọi người và hẹn.
Xin cảm ơn mọi người.
Em chào, cảm ơn thầy.
Thank you. Bye.
Xin cảm ơn các thầy ạ.
Chào thầy, chào mọi người. Dạ, chào mọi người.